In 1991, a car started 19th at Le Mans. Its engine was deliberately detuned from nearly 900 horsepower. It was not the fastest on the grid, not even close. But while the favorites burned through fuel and broke apart, this rotary-powered Mazda just kept going, all the way to a victory so complete the governing body made sure it could never happen again. What they could not outlaw was how it got there. By the time the 1991 season arrived, Mazda was running out of time and options. The rules were changing, and everyone in the paddock knew it. The FIA had already announced that from 1992 onward, only cars with 3.5-liter naturally aspirated engines would be eligible for the top class. That meant Mazda's rotary, ingenious, unconventional, and stubbornly outside the mainstream, was living on borrowed time. For the engineers and team bosses, this wasn't just another race. It was the last real shot to prove that the Wonkel could win on the world's toughest stage before the door slammed shut. The FIA didn't make things easy. To keep the old guard in check, they imposed a ballast penalty on Mazda's 787B, forcing the car to carry extra weight to meet the minimum requirement, even as rivals with the favored engines could run lighter thanks to the new formula. The top 6 grid positions were reserved for teams who played by the upcoming rules, regardless of qualifying times. Mazda's car, despite its speed in practice, was shuffled back to 19th on the grid. Not because it was slow, but because it didn't fit the script. In a twist of bureaucratic irony, the same rivals who dismissed Mazda as a non-threat never bothered to challenge the loophole that allowed the FIA to classify the rotary for ballast. The big teams, focused on their own battles, left Mazda boxed in by technicalities no one thought would matter. No protests were filed. No one expected the green and orange car to do anything but fade quietly into the background. But for Mazda, every lap was a statement. Every hour the 787B ran was another reminder that the establishment's rules couldn't account for stubbornness or for a team that simply refused to break. Bertrand Gachot stepped into the Mazda paddock carrying more than a racing helmet. Weeks before Le Mans, he had been behind bars in Belgium, serving time for a traffic-related incident that nearly ended his season before it began. His arrival at the Circuit de la Sarthe wasn't the orchestrated debut of a star driver joining a top-tier factory team. It was a last-minute rescue, a gamble by a squad short on options and eager for anyone who could keep the car in one piece through the night. Gachot's story bled into the atmosphere of the Mazda garage, a place that felt less like the nerve center of a corporate juggernaut and more like a haven for the determined and the overlooked. Mechanics worked on borrowed time, engineers traded sleep for another round of data checks, and the driver lineup felt patched together from the edges of the sport. Gachot, fresh from a cell, was a living reminder that this was not a campaign built on certainty. It was a rolling wager, run by people with something to prove and nothing left to lose. The 787B's green and orange livery stood out, but it was the team's raw, outsider energy that truly set them apart from the polished favorites lined up ahead on the grid. The R26B engine was a weapon Mazda could have unleashed at full fury. On the dyno, it approached 900 horsepower, enough to threaten any rival outright. But in the 787B, that power stayed locked away. Mazda's engineers dialed it back to around 700 horsepower, not because they could not go faster, but because they understood that endurance racing is not won by the most aggressive car. It is won by the last car standing. This was not a team chasing headlines or trying to intimidate in the pit lane. Mazda's approach was measured, almost stubbornly patient. They sacrificed raw speed for the kind of reliability that could only come from discipline and restraint. Fuel conservation was not a side effect. It was the plan. Every lap, the drivers squeezed out extra distance from every leader, holding back when others lunged forward. The R26B's power curve was flattened, the engine maps set to limit stress, and the team drilled in the art of running just below the red line. On the other side of the paddock, Mercedes treated Le Mans like a sprint. Their C11s thundered around the circuit with the full force of their V8s, chasing lap records and daring fate to keep up. Pit stops came sooner, engines ran hotter, and the pace was relentless until it was not. Gearbox failures, turbo wear, and fatigue crept in as the hours ticked by. While the favorites burned bright and faded, Mazda kept to their rhythm, quietly climbing the order as others faltered. Patience, humility, and relentless focus on the long game were Mazda's weapons. The 787B was not the fastest car on the track, but it was the smart car. In a race where most teams gambled on glory, Mazda gambled on survival. And in the end, that is what put them in victory lane, while the so-called favorites watched from the garage. Ceramic apex seals formed the unsung armor of the R26B, shrugging off the searing heat and friction that would have destroyed metal in a lesser engine. Each seal, made from silicon carbide composite, kept its edge through 24 hours of relentless combustion, holding tight tolerances even as temperatures soared past 1,200 degrees Celsius. 3 spark plugs per rotor, 12 in total, fired in a staggered dance, flattening pressure spikes and coaxing smoother, more complete burns from every drop of fuel. That meant fewer misfires, less stress, and a rotary that could sing at 9,000 revolutions per minute without a cough. A continuously variable intake system replaced fixed runners with a rotary vane, reshaping the path of air on the fly. The result? A torque curve that stayed broad and flat, let drivers lean on low-end power lap after lap, instead of chasing peaks that would punish the engine and guzzle more fuel. Underneath it all, a carbon fiber monocoque gave the 787B a featherweight backbone, just 45 kilograms for the core chassis, absorbing vibration and impact with a stiffness rivals could not match. Aerodynamics finished the job. Adjustable bodywork, sculpted in the wind tunnel, sliced drag and planted the car to the tarmac. The 787B's slippery shape kept the rotary in its sweet spot and trimmed fuel burn, while the downforce let it corner with the confidence of a heavier machine. Every piece, from apex seal to diffuser, was engineered not for the spotlight, but for the long, punishing hours when only the most resilient car would survive. 19th on the grid, the Mazda 787B was hardly a favorite. As dusk settled over Le Mans in June 1991, the car sat deep in the pack, overshadowed by giants like Mercedes and Jaguar. No one expected more than a quiet finish, but as night crept in, the race began to unravel. Gearbox failures sidelined Mercedes, Jaguars limped with mechanical trouble, and the pace at the front proved unsustainable. Mazda's 787B, running a detuned rotary capped at 700 horsepower, kept its rhythm, steady, reliable, never chasing headlines. Hour after hour, the car climbed, not with sudden bursts, but through relentless consistency. Rivals faltered, and the 787B pressed on, its fuel efficiency shaving precious minutes off pit stops. Japanese television broadcast every lap. Millions were glued to the unfolding shock. By dawn, the impossible was close. The 787B was near the front, outlasting the favorites. Inside, Bertrand Gachot completed a transformation few could imagine. Weeks before, he had been behind bars. Now he was part of a lineup quietly rewriting history. This was not a victory of raw speed, but of endurance, a refusal to break. When the checkered flag waved, the 787B had covered 362 laps, outlasting every rival. From 19th to 1st, Mazda's win became a national celebration, and Gachot, once sidelined, stood as a Le Mans winner. Johnny Herbert crossed the line, but his body had nothing left. The final hours in the 787B shredded his feet, raw, blistered, and barely able to press the pedals. Sweat soaked his suit, and every muscle cramped from dehydration. As the checkered flag fell, Herbert slumped over the wheel, eyes unfocused, stomach churning with nausea. Crew members rushed to the car, pulling him out as his legs buckled. He was loaded straight into an ambulance, missing the podium entirely, while his teammates celebrated a victory that he had helped secure. For Herbert, the price of history was measured not in trophies, but in pain and exhaustion, a reminder that endurance racing demands everything and sometimes gives nothing back but survival. The rotary engine didn't get banned for being too fast. It wasn't outlawed for noise or for shattering records. The end came quietly, buried in a rulebook update. After Mazda's triumph, the FIA rewrote the Group C regulations to require 3.5-liter naturally aspirated piston engines. No more room for rotaries, no matter how clean or clever. The R26B's crime wasn't dominance, but daring to survive when others failed. Its victory at Le Mans became a final act of rebellion, a last roar before the door slammed shut. The engine that outlasted the establishment was written out of the future, not by defeat on the track, but by a line of dry text in the regulations. That is how the car that refused to brake was banned, not for winning too much, but for proving it could. Today, Mazda's Le Mans triumph remains unmatched, a win secured by restraint, not raw power. The rotary engine's reliability rewrote the rulebook, only to be exiled the very next year. In a world obsessed with speed, sometimes the real threat is outlasting everyone else. What would you have banned?